In November of 1968, a small passenger ship named the Aurora departed from Dover, England, heading toward the French port city of Calais. There were 58 passengers and 12 crew members on board. Some were returning home. Some were traveling for work. Others were simply trying to cross the English Channel before winter storms became worse. At the time, nobody aboard the ship could have imagined that their journey would become one of the Channel's greatest unsolved disappearances. Shortly after midnight, weather conditions began to change. Heavy winds moved across the water. Rain reduced visibility almost completely. And somewhere in the darkness of the channel, the Aurora sent its final radar signal at exactly 1:17 a.m. Then it vanished. No distress call was ever received. No confirmed wreckage was found. And despite weeks of search operations involving both British and French authorities, the sea gave almost nothing back. Over time, newspapers stopped talking about the tragedy. The story slowly faded into history. Another lost ship swallowed by cold water and fog. But more than 40 years later, in the summer of 2011, everything changed. A marine survey team mapping previously unexplored sections of the English Channel discovered a large object nearly 90 meters beneath the surface. At first, the sonar images were unclear. But after further scans, investigators realized they were looking at the wreck of a passenger ship. When divers finally descended to inspect it, they discovered something unbelievable. The missing Aurora had finally been found. News of the discovery spread across Europe within hours. For decades, the ship had been considered completely lost. Now, after 43 years beneath the sea, people would finally see what remained of it. The first divers later described the wreck as deeply unsettling. Not because of damage. And not because of bodies. But because the inside of the ship looked strangely preserved. The corridors were still recognizable. Dining tables remained in place. Some cabin doors were still partially open. Suitcases sat untouched beneath collapsed beds. Children's shoes rested near rusted staircases. It felt less like entering a shipwreck, and more like walking into a moment in time that had somehow refused to disappear. One diver later said, "The strangest part was the silence. You start imagining the lives people had before that night. And suddenly the ship doesn't feel empty anymore." During the first 2 days, divers mostly cataloged personal belongings and structural damage. But on the third day of exploration, one discovery changed everything. Inside a small cabin on the lower deck, hidden beneath a collapsed wooden shelf, divers found a sealed metal box wrapped in thick layers of cloth. Inside the box were several black and white photographs, a silver engagement ring, and dozens of handwritten letters. The letters belonged to a 24-year-old passenger named Daniel Mercer. And every single one of them had been written to the same person. A young French woman named Elise Laurent. At first, investigators believed the letters were simply another tragic detail connected to the wreck. But after historians and journalists began reading them, the story quickly became something much larger than the sinking of a ship. Because hidden inside those letters was the story of a love that had never truly ended. Daniel and Elise first met in the spring of 1966. Daniel lived in Dover and worked at a small shipping office near the harbor. Elise lived in Calais and worked inside a quiet bookstore only a few streets from the waterfront. According to friends and surviving family members, their meeting happened completely by accident. Daniel had traveled to France for a short holiday. One afternoon, while trying to escape sudden rain, he entered Elise's bookstore. At first, the conversation between them was small and awkward. Daniel bought a book he never actually intended to read. But the next day, he returned. Then the day after that. Soon, the two began spending entire afternoons together walking through the narrow streets near the harbor. When Daniel returned to England, both of them assumed the relationship would slowly disappear with distance. Instead, it grew stronger. A week after returning home, Daniel sent Elise his first letter. Then another. Soon they were writing to each other constantly. At first, the letters were simple. Stories about ordinary days. Cold weather near the docks. Customers entering Elise's bookstore. But over time, the letters became more personal. Daniel wrote about how empty Dover suddenly felt without her. Elise described how she kept looking toward the harbor every evening, hoping another letter would arrive. One recovered letter read, "Sometimes I wonder if you look at the same sky and think about me too. I think that's what love really is. Finding pieces of someone in places they've never even seen." Another letter said, "I walked along the docks this morning before sunrise. The sea was gray and completely silent. And somehow I kept wishing you were there to see it with me." As months passed, their relationship became more serious. Daniel no longer wanted to stay in England. He wanted to move permanently to France and build a life with Elise. The letters slowly changed from romance into plans for the future. They talked about renting a small apartment near the sea, about adopting a dog, about growing old somewhere quiet. One letter even included a rough sketch Daniel had drawn of a tiny seaside home with a window facing the ocean. The more investigators read, the more real their relationship became. This was no longer simply the story of a missing ship. It was the story of two people who had built an entire future together through paper and ink. Friends later revealed that Daniel had become unusually nervous in the days before boarding the Aurora. Not because he feared the journey, but because he believed his real life was finally about to begin. One co-worker later remembered Daniel saying something strange the night before he left. "Being this happy almost scares me." On November 18, 1968, Daniel boarded the Aurora carrying only a suitcase, the letters from Elise, and a small silver engagement ring hidden inside his coat pocket. He planned to propose after arriving in Calais. Meanwhile, across the channel, Elise waited for him. She arrived at the harbor hours before the ship was expected to arrive. At first, the atmosphere felt normal. Dock workers smoked cigarettes near the pier. Fishing boats moved slowly through the fog. Streetlights reflected softly across the water. Then the storm arrived. The wind became violent. Rain covered the harbor. One by one, people began leaving the docks. But Elise stayed. She believed Daniel would keep his promise. As the hours passed, harbor officials slowly realized something was wrong. The Aurora was gone. No signal. No communication. Nothing. People urged Elise to go home. But she refused. According to one witness, she remained near the harbor long after midnight, staring into the storm as if she expected Daniel to emerge from the fog at any moment. He never did. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. Eventually, most people accepted that everyone aboard the Aurora had died. But Elise never fully allowed herself to believe it. The recovered letters explained why. In Daniel's final unfinished letter, investigators found words that would later become famous across Europe. "This time, I really am coming. And I won't make you wait anymore. Wait for me." After the wreck became public in 2011, television networks across France began covering the story extensively. Then, during one live broadcast, an elderly woman called into the program. It was Elise Laurent. At 71 years old, her voice trembled as she spoke about Daniel publicly for the first time in decades. She explained that she had never married, never moved away from Calais, and never stopped visiting the harbor. Every year, on the anniversary of the storm, she still returned to the exact same place where she had waited for him in 1968. One interviewer eventually asked her a question millions of viewers were already wondering. Why continue waiting after all these years? Elise remains silent for several seconds before answering. Because some people are not truly gone when they disappear. As long as someone still waits for them, a part of them remains alive. That sentence spread rapidly across newspapers and television broadcasts throughout Europe. For many people, the discovery of the Aurora stopped being a maritime mystery. Instead, it became something far more human. A reminder that sometimes the deepest things lost at sea are not ships, but the lives people imagined together before everything disappeared.